masukkan semisal 000003 dengan nama Rahmayani. Simpan. Kemudian kita tes perintah filter. Di sini perintah filternya berdasarkan nama. Kita masukkan semisal namanya Irham. Di sini yang muncul hanya nomor rekam medis dengan nama Irham. Kemudian kita klik 2 kali, maka akan muncul tampilan seperti ini. Kita ganti pekerjaannya menjadi mahasiswa. Kemudian kita klik ubah. Di sini pekerjaannya telah terganti. Kemudian kita keluar. Setelah itu selanjutnya kita masuk ke entitas utama petugas. Di sini kita masukkan NIP petugasnya 19.03054. Di sini kita tes perintah filter berdasarkan nama, misal Indah. Kemudian kita klik 2 kali. Kita ganti alamatnya menjadi Jalan Hayam Nurut. Kemudian kita klik ubah. Maka di sini alamatnya telah terganti. Kita keluar. Selanjutnya kita ke entitas utama yaitu dokter. Di sini kita masukkan kode dokternya yaitu D3. Kita tes perintah filter. Di sini dokter gigi. Kita klik double. Kita ganti jadwal tugas menjadi Senin sampai Jumat. Kemudian kita klik ubah. Maka di sini jadwal tugasnya telah berubah. Kita keluar. Selanjutnya kita ke entitas ruangan. Di sini kita masukkan kode ruangan RJ1. Nama ruangan poli gigi. Tarifnya 50.000. Kemudian simpan. Kemudian RJ2. Kemudian kita masukkan perintah filter berdasarkan kode ruangan. Di sini kita masukkan semisal RJ. Maka yang muncul hanya ruangan berkode RJ. Kita klik. Di sini kita ganti tarifnya menjadi 60.000. Ubah. Kemudian kita keluar. Selanjutnya kita ke entitas utama yaitu diagnosa. Di sini kita masukkan kode diagnosa A01. Diagnosanya demam tifoid. Kemudian kita simpan. Di sini kita masukkan perintah filter berdasarkan kode diagnosa. Kita masukkan A91. Maka akan muncul tampilannya seperti ini. Kemudian kita keluar. Setelah itu kita ke entitas utama, kemudian kita ke formulir tindakan. Di sini kita masukkan kode tindakannya 19.18. Pasang infus. Di sini kita tes perintah filter berdasarkan kode tindakan. Di sini kita masukkan kode tindakannya semisal 19.18. Di sini kita klik double. Kita masukkan tarifnya semisal 100.000 123, kemudian kita ubah. Setelah itu kita keluar. Selanjutnya kita ke entitas relasi. Di sini kita masukkan tempat pendaftaran pasien yaitu TP2RJ. Kita masukkan nomor rekam medisnya semisal 000001. Kemudian kita klik double, maka akan muncul nama pasien, alamat serta umur. Setelah itu kita tes perintah filter berdasarkan tanggal kunjungan. Kita masukkan bulan 12. Di sini hanya muncul nomor RM 00003. Kemudian kita klik double, kita input, kita ganti ruangannya menjadi poli gigi. Kemudian kita ubah. Setelah itu kita keluar. Kemudian selanjutnya kita ke entitas relasi. Di sini tempat pendaftaran pasien, kita ke TP2RI. Kita masukkan nomor rekam medisnya semisal 000002. Kemudian kita klik double, maka akan muncul nama pasien, alamat serta umurnya. Di sini kita tes perintah filter berdasarkan tanggal masuk. Kita perintah filter untuk bulan 12, maka di sini muncul dengan nomor RM 00003. Kita klik double, kita input. Di sini kita ganti ruangannya menjadi ruangan melati. Kemudian kita klik double, maka akan muncul kode ruangan yaitu RI1. Kemudian kita klik ubah. Maka di sini nama ruangannya telah berubah. Kita keluar. Selanjutnya kita ke entitas relasi lagi, ke pelayanan pasien. Di sini ada rawat jalan. Kita ke rawat jalan, kita masukkan nomor rekam medisnya semisal 000003. Kita klik double. Maka di sini akan muncul nama pasien, ruangan, alamat, umur, serta petugas. Di sini kita tes perintah filter berdasarkan tanggal kunjungan. Kita masukkan pada bulan 10 tanggal 1, maka akan muncul dengan nomor rekam medis 000003. Kita klik double, kita input, kita ganti diagnosanya menjadi sakit kepala. Kemudian kita klik double, kemudian ubah. Di sini diagnosanya berubah menjadi sakit kepala. Kemudian kita keluar. Setelah itu kita ke entitas relasi pelayanan pasien rawat inap. Di sini kita masukkan nomor rekam medisnya semisal 000002. Kita klik double. Di sini muncul nama pasien, ruangan, alamat, umur, serta petugas. Kemudian kita tes perintah filter berdasarkan lama rawat. Di sini kita masukkan 4 hari, maka akan muncul nomor rekam medis 010001. Kemudian kita klik double. Di sini kita ganti diagnosanya menjadi sakit kepala. Kemudian kita ubah. Di sini diagnosanya telah berubah. Kemudian kita keluar. Setelah itu kita ke entes relasi lagi, kita ke IGD. Di sini kita masukkan nomor rekam medisnya semisal 000003. Setelah itu kita tes perintah filter berdasarkan cara datang. Kita masukkan di sini misal sendiri. Kemudian akan muncul dengan nomor rekam medis 0003. Kita klik double. Kemudian di sini kita input, kita ganti jam kedatangannya menjadi jam 10 AM. Kemudian kita ubah. Di sini jam kedatangannya telah berubah. Kemudian kita keluar. Selanjutnya kita ke pemeriksaan penunjang. Di sini kita masukkan nomor rekam medisnya semisal 000002. Kemudian kita klik double. Di sini kita masukkan perintah filter. Perintah filter berdasarkan tanggal pemeriksaan, kita masukkan bulan 12, tanggal 6. Maka akan muncul dengan nomor rekam medis 000003. Kemudian kita klik double. Di sini akan muncul. Kemudian kita ganti pemeriksaannya menjadi pemeriksaan urin lengkap. Kemudian kita ubah. Di sini telah berubah, kemudian kita keluar. Setelah itu kita ke apotik. Di sini kita masukkan rekam medisnya 000001. Kemudian di sini kita tes perintah filter berdasarkan tanggal transaksi, kita masukkan bulan 12. Maka di sini muncul dengan nomor rekam medis 000001. Kita klik double. Di sini kita ganti nama obatnya menjadi obat betadin. Kemudian tarifnya kita ganti juga menjadi 35.000. Kemudian kita tes perintah ubah. Maka di sini tarifnya dan nama obatnya telah berubah. Kemudian kita keluar. Selanjutnya kita ke entitas relasi lagi. Di sini ada UKM. Di sini kita masukkan nomor rekam medis semisal 000003. Kita klik double. Setelah itu kita tes perintah filter berdasarkan jenis kegiatan. Di sini kita masukkan semisal vaksin. Maka akan muncul nomor rekam medisnya yaitu 000003. Kemudian kita klik double. Di sini kita input, kita ganti keterangannya menjadi vaksin Moderna. Kita tes perintah ubah. Maka di sini di keterangan menjadi vaksin Moderna. Kemudian kita keluar. Di sini kita ke entitas relasi. Kita ke formulir terakhir yaitu pembayaran. Di sini kita masukkan nomor rekam medisnya semisal 000003. Maka akan muncul nama pasiennya yaitu Rahmayani. Kemudian kita klik rawat jalan. Di sini muncul tindakan dan tarifnya, jenis pemeriksaan dan tarifnya, obat dan tarifnya, serta ruangan dan tarifnya. Di sini karena rawat jalan, maka lama rawatnya hanya 1 hari, maka tarif ruangannya menjadi 60.000. Kemudian total tarifnya 372.000. Kemudian di sini tanggal pembayarannya semisal tanggal 21 bulan 12. Kemudian kita simpan. Setelah itu kita input lagi. Semisal nomor rekam medisnya 000002. Di sini nama pasiennya Irma. Kemudian kita klik rawat inap. Di sini muncul tindakannya dan tarif, jenis pemeriksaan dan tarif, obat dan tarif, dan ruangan dan tarif. Di sini ruangan anggrek bertarif 100.000 per hari. Maka di sini lama rawatnya ada 3 hari. Kemudian tarif ruangannya menjadi 300.000. Maka total tarifnya menjadi 652.000. Kita simpan. Selanjutnya kita tes perintah filter. Di sini kita masukkan tanggalnya, semisal bulan 12 tanggal 21, maka akan muncul dengan nomor reka medis yaitu 000003. Kemudian kita klik double. Di sini semisal kita ganti tanggal pembayarannya menjadi tanggal 22 bulan 12 tahun 2021. Kemudian kita ubah. Maka di sini tanggalnya telah berubah. Kemudian kita keluar. Itulah tadi penjelasan singkat mengenai formulir Visual Basic yang telah saya buat, yaitu Puskesmas. Lebih dan kurangnya mohon dimaafkan. Akhir kata, wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Hello guys, today will be a lesson for those of you who want to start using Vue.js with Laravel but were hesitating and maybe were afraid to start. In this lesson I will show you a practical example switching this project you see on the screen from typical Laravel Blade and backend to Vue.js version, which will look a little bit different. So if we refresh the page, you see the loading for a fraction of a second. So this is a Vue.js version with the API. So I will do live coding of switching typical Laravel to Vue and API, and I hope you will learn from that. And this is probably the most simple example I could come up with, and I'm a big believer that people should learn from practical examples. Without even knowing all the theory behind Vue.js and JavaScript, practical example is the best way to start. So let's start. So what do we have here? We have a home page of a catalog. On the left-hand side, you see the list of categories, fake names, and then list of products, also with fake names, fake prices, and descriptions. In the database, it's very simple. 10 categories and 10 products with relationship to category ID. In the code, there's only one route in routes web PHP file, get to the home controller. Home controller index gets all the categories and all the products. Without any pagination or filters, I just thought to go simple with this example, and we return the view home, which just returns the for each of the products and categories like this. So for each products, and then for each categories on the left. And the front-end theme is taken from a Bootstrap theme from Start Bootstrap Shop homepage. It's really simple based on Bootstrap 4. Now let's transform that to Vue.js. Where do we start? First, we will start with the backend with the API layer that would return products and categories to the front end, and then we will take care of Vue.js. So let's go to our routes API PHP and create two routes. Route get categories, and it will be API controller, category controller, index. A few things here to mention. It's a good practice to put your API controllers in their own subfolder and namespace. And also a controller is named in singular form, category controller and not categories controller. But it's just a good practice, it's not required. And we duplicate that role into products, and it will be product controller as well. For now they don't exist, so let's generate them. So open our terminal, PHP artisan, make controller, API / category controller. An API folder doesn't exist yet, and it will be created with the controller. And also let's do product controller. Product controller. Okay, let's open our tree of files, and we see controller, API, category controller. An important thing, if you specify subfolder here, it will also generate the namespace for you, which is correct. So don't forget the namespace for subfolders. And we go index, and we return all the categories. Category, all. That's it for now. And for product controller, we do really similar thing. Index, return, product, all. Let's try that in a browser. So we go project test /API /categories. By default, all the routes in routes API PHP are prefixed with API. And this is our result. It's not really readable, right? So I suggest to use some API client like Postman, where we can go and copy paste the URL, click send, and this is a much more readable format. So all the fields of categories. But what I like to do is to hide some fields which are unnecessary or maybe even harmful to show. So web clients don't really need to know when the category was created. Is it new or not? So let's hide created at and updated at, and for that we will create API resource. PHP artisan make resource category resource. And similar, we will have product resource. And it will generate a few files in app HTTP resources, category resource. And resource file is a set of rules what to return from the API. So instead of default parent to array, we will return exactly what we need. So return array, and for the category we need ID of this ID, This is actually the category object, and then name this name, and delete that line. And it looks pretty pointless, right? So we're listing the same ID and name and attaching that to variable, but the point here is to not list created at and updated at. We save the resource, and in controller, instead of doing category all, we will do category resource collection, and then category all as a parameter. Let's try it out and see what happens. If we refresh in the Postman, send the same thing, two things happen. First, as we wanted, created at and updated at are gone. Also, another layer of data. And this is a good practice enabled by default in Laravel, and I advise you to leave it like that because in addition to data, there might be more information like error messages, pagination, next page, and stuff like that. And let's do the same for the products. We will actually copy paste the same thing to product resource, and we need description additionally. This description, and also price. And price is an interesting thing. API resources are for set of rules not only for hiding some fields, but also to transform them. Before the resources came to Laravel in Laravel 5.5, people were using something like transformers and some packages to transform the data. So eloquent results may bring more data, but the actual return from the API may be different or smaller. And for the price, we need to do exactly that. Price is saved in the database as integer, like this, and you can Google articles about precision why it needs to be like that. So Google precision double float money, and a lot of articles why you should not store the database floats for the money, but you need to transform them while returning. So we need, on the price, we need to do number format, this price divided by 100 with 2 decimals. And in the controller, we do product resource collection product all. Let's try the products actually. /products, we send, and we have an error. This is the beauty of live coding, products controller. Of course, I made mistake which I've mentioned myself. So instead of category singular, I did products in plural. Okay, product controller it should be. Let's refresh, send. Now we have what we need. Product ID, name, description, and price. And if we return how it should look visually, that's exactly what we need. So name, price, and description. And for the category, we need only name. So we took care of the API of the backend. We are returning products and categories and API endpoints. So API URLs are called endpoints. Now let's go to Vue.js route. Let's go to our Blade file and let's transform it to not load the HTML immediately. Instead of all the container with the categories list and products list, we will have one div element which will contain all the actions of Vue.js. So this is how Vue.js works. You need to have an element with some kind of ID, and we will call it app. It's pretty typical. And inside of that, everything will be happening. All the magic of Vue.js. And you will specify that the app is the core element of your Vue.js. We will get to that in a second. And inside of that app, you can do HTML, you can do whatever, and also you can load the components. Vue.js components, and we will have one component which will contain all the logic of here. So let's call that component front page, and it looks like an HTML tag, right? But in reality, it will be a Vue.js component which will contain all of that. So let's copy and paste all of that div container, in fact, cut and paste. So we don't need that at all, and that yield content is irrelevant. It's from some older project. So this means everything else will be static and this part will be dynamic. And let's create a component in resources.js folder. Let's create a subfolder components. And let's create a component.vue file, new file. And it's the best practice to name them in camel case, so from uppercase letter. So front.vue. And we paste all of that content for now in Blade language. And every Vue component has two parts, the template, so the HTML part, and the JavaScript part. So this should be wrapped in template. So all of that is a template. I will reformat it with Command-Alt-L in PHP Storm. So this is our template for Vue.js. And now we need to tell Laravel or tell Vue.js that this component should be used and div app should be the main element. And this is done in file resources.js app.js, which looks like this in default Laravel. We need to require Vue.js, then tell the ID app to be main, and then load the front component. So 3 things. And I will just copy and paste the code that I've prepared. This is how it looks in terms of syntax. So we require Vue.js. We tell that our component front page, which is the same as here, is attached to components front.view. And we also load the new Vue instance with ID app, which is the same as ID app here. So we delete all of that. To make it all work, we need to actually install Vue.js, or in fact require it. And it's pretty similar to Laravel requirements like composer install, but for frontend there is a separate file called package.json. Not composer.json, but package.json. And in here I will also copy and paste Vue.js with a certain version, which is 2.5 in this case, but any version should be okay for this simple example. First, as an experiment, let's delete all the dynamic data, and I will show you that it actually works and how it is compiled. So let's delete the for each part of the categories. Let's delete the product parts. And that's it. So we should see shop catalog and then empty page. We save the view. And final thing I wanted to show you here. So in that home blade, as you can see, there is no data. So we don't need to return anything from controller here. And in fact, we don't even need the controller then. So in our web PHP, we change get from controller to route view home. And that's it. So there's no controller. It will work this way. It will load the blade with HTML, and then there will be JavaScript calling the API and loading the data. So as you can see in home blade, there's no actually blade syntax, except for this one maybe, but that could be replaced with something like this. Okay, let's get back to practice. To install all of that and to compile all of that, differently from the backend, you need to run some commands. And there are 2 commands to run, npm install and npm run dev. That's the default structure. It could be different for your environment. There are more commands and parameters, but by default, let's stick with those 2 for the simple example. So we go to our project and do npm install. And this will take quite a lot of time, and it will install quite a lot of things. So be prepared to have like 100 megabytes on your drive and probably good internet connection as well. And that's it. It is done in 21 seconds. It's okay. So for a really small project, it's quick, but if you load more stuff, it may take minutes. And now we do npm run dev. Building the modules, and as you can see, Laravel mix message built successful. And the result of all of that is a file in public. So public JS app.js, which is a compiled file. It's really ugly. It's really long JavaScript file, so you don't need to know what's inside of that. But it is actually the result that should be loaded inside of the blade. So in our case, we'll have script, source, and then Laravel mix command mix JS app.js. And that's it, we loaded the JavaScript. And now let's reload our page. So this is how it looked before. As you remember, we removed all the products and categories, new tab, project test, and it is empty, but it didn't throw any errors, and it is successful. The proof of that is text shop catalog, which comes from Vue component, from here. So it's not in the blade, but it is loaded by Vue.js. So this is the proof that it's actually working. And now let's load the data from the API. So as I said, Vue component has 2 parts, template and JavaScript. And let's create the second part. We go script, and then there's some weird syntax which I don't really want to explain. It's export default, and inside of that you will post all the magic, as I call that. And there are 3 parts we need to take care of that. Private properties of that component. So that component.view, you can imagine that as a PHP class, as object-oriented class, which will have its own parameters, its own properties, which will be loaded from the API. So what properties we need to have? Products and categories, right? And we go data, function, callback function, return this, and go categories by default will be an array, and products by default will be an array, empty array. So we define the properties similar to PHP object-oriented class. Next, we need to go and define all the actions that should happen when that component is loaded. And this is called mounted. And inside of that mounted, we will list all the actions. And actions will be defined by private methods. So see the similarities. View component is pretty similar to PHP class. It has properties and also it has methods. Methods. And you just list the methods. And we'll have load categories, for example, function, which will load the category. And then method load products, function, which will load the products. And in the mounted, we will just call both of them. So this load categories, as you can see, it's already auto-completed in PHP Storm, and also this load products. You can take a pause and take a look at different syntax. So sometimes there are brackets, sometimes there are semicolons. So you can read the Vue.js documentation for that. But I will just move on with the example. So this function, load categories, should load the categories from the API, then assign that to the variables. So this categories should be assigned, and then catch errors if there's anything wrong happening with the API. To load the API, we have a package called Axios, which is by default in Laravel here. And for those of you who are familiar with jQuery, it should be $get or $ajax. In this case, it's Axios. Get the URL, and we do then something, and also catch something. So this is the syntax. We get the URL, something is happening to assign the variables, and if something goes wrong, there's a catch. The URL is /API/categories, the one that we created previously. Then we need to assign the response data to the private variable of this categories. And this is the syntax, response this categories equals response data and data again. It looks pretty complicated, but response data is the actual data returned from the API. And since inside of that, as you remember from API resource, we have data also, we need to add that data again. And in catch, you can do whatever you want with an error, but console log error message. That's it. Let's reformat that, remove the unnecessary stuff. PHP Storm helped me to reformat that. And now what is happening here actually? We load the API from the server, and then we get the response and we assign that to this categories. And Vue.js magic will assign that to private variable, and we can show that variable here in the template part. And we will do exactly that. Okay, so I will just close the sidebar for now, and we'll just paste the actual code. So instead of for each categories, we will have categories as private variable, and this is the syntax of Vue.js of for each loop, v4. In Blade, it would be for each categories as category. In Vue.js, it's like this, and then category becomes the variable of that loop. And we need category name here. Let's launch and see if it works and if I didn't miss anything. And again, we cannot just refresh the browser. We need to recompile the stuff. So npm install and npm run dev. Okay, npm install is finished, npm run dev, compiled successfully. And now let's refresh the page. Refresh. And what do we see on the left-hand side? List of categories. So let's recap what is happening here behind the scenes. The component is loaded by